If you think you know what isolation feels like, you've never heard the echoes of Pelican Bay's short corridor. At the northern edge of California, where the fog rolls in thick from the Pacific and the redwoods lean like silent witnesses, stands a prison designed to erase men. Pelican Bay State Prison, the end of the line. It's where California sends those too violent, too dangerous, or too unpredictable for anywhere else. But behind its concrete walls lies a deeper layer of control, the Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU. And buried within that SHU is a stretch of cells that inmates whispered about like a myth, the short corridor. It wasn't a corridor in the ordinary sense. It was a laboratory for human endurance, a stretch of steel and silence that held some of the state's most feared prison gang leaders, the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla family. But the real story wasn't about gangs. It was about what the system was doing to the human mind, 1 hour of sunlight, 23 of darkness, every single day, for years. On the morning of January 12, 2011, a guard named Officer Mark Jensen was doing his routine walkthrough when he noticed something wrong. A food tray sat untouched at the cell door of inmate Luis Spider Martinez, a man who hadn't missed a meal in over a decade. Martinez had been in the short corridor since the late 90s, serving life for a double homicide tied to gang retaliation. To most, he was a ghost story, a leader whose influence extended beyond walls. Jensen called out. No response. He tapped the door. Still nothing. Protocol demanded backup. Within minutes, 3 more guards arrived, and the silence thickened. The steel door unlocked with a metallic clank, echoing through the corridor. The air inside was stale, still, and heavy, like the room itself had stopped breathing. Martinez sat motionless on his bunk, his eyes fixed on the wall. On that wall, drawn in faint pencil, were words that no one would ever forget. They promised light. But they built darkness. He was alive, barely, but something in his mind had broken. For years, Martinez had been part of what prison officials called the experiment of control. Inside the short corridor, they believed if you separated the shot callers, the gang generals, you could weaken the empires that ruled the yards. But instead, it created something worse. These men learned to communicate through vents, pipes, and the rhythm of taps on concrete. Entire orders for riots, peace treaties, even assassinations were coordinated through the walls. The isolation didn't stop the system, it made it smarter, quieter, more dangerous. By 2011, the prison administration was under scrutiny. Lawsuits had begun to stack up, Ashker versus Braum among them, accusing the state of cruel and unusual punishment. But even then, the short corridor remained untouchable. Reporters were denied access, records went missing, and inmates who spoke out were transferred or lost in paperwork. Officer Jensen wasn't new to Pelican Bay. He'd seen men break before. He'd seen them scream, claw at the walls, beg for voices that weren't there. But what unsettled him most was that Martinez hadn't made a sound. That night, Jensen stayed late in the control booth. He watched the monitors, grainy, black and white CCTV feeds of each cell. At 2:37 a.m., he noticed movement. Not in Martinez's cell, but in the one next to it. Cell 118. That belonged to Ghost Renteria, another long-term isolate, rumored to have once been a hitman for the Mexican Mafia. Ghost was awake, pacing, tapping the wall in a strange rhythm. Tap, pause, tap tap, pause, tap tap tap. It was communication, code, but it wasn't the normal kind the staff had been trained to recognize. It sounded patterned, deliberate, almost like a countdown. Jensen leaned forward, the static from the monitors filling the silence. Then, through the thin corridor mic, he heard it, a whisper, faint but clear enough to freeze him in his chair. Tell them, we're still here. He rewound the footage 3 times. Each time, the whisper stayed. Each time, it came from a cell that hadn't had its intercom enabled in weeks. The wire had been cut months earlier. By morning, the warden's office was buzzing. The official story would later claim it was audio interference. But those who worked that night knew something was wrong. Something that went beyond inmates and guards, something structural. For years, the short corridor had been a self-contained world. Guards assigned there rotated quickly, burnout was routine. Psychological breakdowns weren't uncommon. The line between watcher and watched began to blur. And as rumors spread of organized hunger strikes, coded messages, and secret pacts among rival gangs, one thing became clear: isolation had failed. Outside the prison, civil rights attorneys were beginning to connect dots. Inside, Jensen began keeping notes. He wrote down every whisper, every unexplained blackout, every time an inmate claimed to hear voices through the vents. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern. One evening, while reviewing his notes, he came across a name he didn't remember writing: C-section leader, confirmed. The handwriting was his, but the ink was fresher than the rest. Beneath it, 2 words had been underlined twice: control experiment. He didn't remember writing that either. By the end of that week, 2 more inmates stopped eating. The temperature in the corridor dropped unnaturally low, malfunctioning vents, the report claimed. But for those inside, it felt like something else was creeping in. On February 4th, during a standard head count, Jensen was ordered to deliver a sealed envelope to the administrative wing. It was labeled confidential, internal audit. When he returned to the corridor an hour later, Martinez's cell light was off, unusual, since lights in SHU cells were controlled externally. He checked the control board. Every switch was still on. That was the first night the cameras in the short corridor went dark for 7 minutes. And when they flickered back to life, one cell door was open. The system would later claim it was a mechanical glitch. But Jensen knew better. He'd been standing there the whole time. He hadn't heard a sound. Not a door opening, not a step. Just silence. The kind that sinks deep enough to make you doubt your own breathing. The kind that changes you. But what he didn't know yet was that those 7 minutes would become the most investigated, and the most redacted, in Pelican Bay's history. Because when they unlocked that cell the next morning, nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. They said the cameras glitched. But 7 minutes of footage don't just vanish, not in Pelican Bay, not in the short corridor. When the system rebooted at dawn, the first thing Officer Mark Jensen noticed wasn't the open door. It was the absence of sound. Usually, the corridor hummed faintly, the air vents, the low buzz of fluorescent lights, the static hum of electricity. That morning, it was dead quiet. Even the ventilation system had stopped. Cell 118, Ghost Renteria's cell, stood open. The others were sealed tight. There was no sign of a breakout, no forced entry, no alarms. Just an open door, a single paper folded neatly on the metal bunk, and a pencil rolling slowly back and forth on the floor. The paper wasn't addressed to anyone. It carried only a single line written in jagged block letters: "We don't disappear. We wait." The warden, Harold McKee, arrived within the hour, flanked by the internal investigations team. By noon, the short corridor was under full lockdown. No inmate movement. No staff rotation. No access without clearance. Jensen was ordered to stay quiet. He signed a non-disclosure memo that same day. But what happened next spread through Pelican Bay like wildfire anyway. Because by the time they rechecked the logbook, something impossible appeared: Renteria's biometric scan still registered as inside cell. The cameras had him missing, the door had been unlocked, yet the motion sensors showed nothing. And then, 2 cells down, Luis "Spider" Martinez began talking again. He hadn't said a word in weeks, hadn't looked at anyone, hadn't touched his food. But now, he pressed his face close to the metal slot and called for Jensen. When Jensen leaned in, Martinez whispered just loud enough for the mic to catch it: "They're not gone. They're moving through the walls." It would have sounded delusional, another inmate slipping into madness, if not for what came next. That same week, at 2:14 a.m., guards monitoring the corridor noticed flickering movement on the infrared feed. Not shapes. Not shadows. Heat patterns. Several of them. passing between the cells, moving in rhythmic formation, left to right to left, like patrols. But no living person was on the roster to be there. The official report later called it a thermal malfunction. But when staff entered the corridor the next morning, they found smudges on the inside of the glass observation ports, as if someone had pressed a warm hand against the surface from the wrong side. Jensen tried to convince himself it was a trick of the lighting. But when he checked the cell inventory sheets, something caught his attention. 3 inmates from the short corridor, Renteria, Spider Martinez, and an older prisoner named Henry Vega, an ex-Aryan Brotherhood associate, had all been listed under a new classification code, pending transfer, SS. He'd never seen that code before. When he asked his supervisor, he got a short answer: "It's not your concern." That's when Jensen started his own private investigation. He began copying his control booth logs into a personal notebook, documenting every temperature drop, every unexplained blackout, every instance of voices through sealed vents. The more he wrote, the more he noticed patterns, timing. The whispers, the tapping, the malfunctions, all happened between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. They called it the hour of silence. On the night of March 8, 2011, he stayed behind again, alone. This time, he recorded the corridor feed on his own camcorder, an old handheld device he wasn't supposed to have. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the lights in Section D blinked once, twice, then went out. The feed kept rolling. And in the darkness, something began, a series of taps echoing from every cell, all in unison. Not random noise, synchronized rhythm. The same 3-beat code Jensen had once heard from Renteria's cell. Then, the whisper returned. Clearer this time. Not one voice, dozens, layered over each other like static on a broken radio. Control is the illusion. We own the silence. He froze. His heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears. Then, another sound. Metal. The faint squeal of a cell door unlatching. When the lights snapped back on, everything was in order again. Every cell closed. Every inmate accounted for. Except the paper tray on cell 121, Vega's cell, now held something new. A hand-drawn map of the short corridor. And marked in red ink at the center, SS equals Silence Syndicate. The name didn't mean anything to staff. But to those who'd worked in isolation units long enough, it hit like a cold realization. There had always been rumors of a network of long-term SHU inmates coordinating through code, decades of communication linking Pelican Bay, Corcoran, Tehachapi, and Folsom. But no one believed it was real. Now, the map suggested otherwise. The prison tried to shut it down. They confiscated notebooks, limited yard access, even replaced the entire ventilation system. But it didn't matter. The tapping continued, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud it woke staff in the control room. Then came the first hunger strike. It started small, a few cells refusing food. But within a week, it spread through multiple units, coordinated with precision no one could explain. More than 30,000 inmates across California joined, protesting conditions in long-term solitary confinement. The state called it organized manipulation. The inmates called it awakening. For Jensen, it was the first time he saw the corridor not as a collection of broken men, but as a system breeding rebellion in silence. And as the hunger strike grew, the administration began to crack. Warden McKee ordered emergency meetings with Sacramento. Lawyers demanded transparency. The name Silence Syndicate started circulating among internal memos, always redacted, always marked confidential. But something else began to unravel: Jensen himself. He'd started dreaming of the corridor, hearing the tapping even when he was home. His wife said he talked in his sleep, numbers, patterns, names. He tried to ignore it, but one night, when he turned on the local news, the story stopped him cold. The anchor was reporting from Los Angeles County Jail, covering another hunger strike, and behind her, faintly visible on a wall scribbled in pencil, were the same words found in Martinez's cell months earlier: "They promised light, but they built darkness." That phrase had never been released publicly. That's when Jensen knew, whatever the Silence Syndicate was, it wasn't confined to Pelican Bay anymore. It had spread, invisible but coordinated, through vents, through letters, through code. And someone, or something, inside the system wanted it to stay that way. Because just a week later, he was summoned to the warden's office. McKee didn't waste words. "You've seen too much," he said flatly. "You're being reassigned. Effective immediately." When Jensen asked why, the warden slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, showing a corridor view Jensen instantly recognized. Only this wasn't Pelican Bay. It was Corcoran. And the open door in that photo? The same one he'd seen weeks earlier in the short corridor. Same door. Same cell number. Same message on the wall. That was the day Officer Mark Jensen realized something terrifying. Pelican Bay wasn't the origin of the Silence Syndicate. It was just one part of a much larger map. In the corridors, they were all connected. By the summer of 2013, Pelican Bay had become the epicenter of something far larger than a prison protest. The world outside was starting to listen. Human rights organizations, journalists, and even federal observers were demanding answers. But inside the concrete maze of the SHU, the silence was still louder than ever. Officer Mark Jensen, now reassigned to records in the administrative wing, spent his nights buried in boxes of redacted reports, trying to trace how far the Silence Syndicate had spread. Every file he opened had something missing, timestamps blacked out, names replaced with numbers, or worse, entire pages torn away. One document stood out. It was labeled Interfacility Communication Report, Code SS, dated 2009. It referenced inmate activity across multiple California prisons, Corcoran, Folsom, San Quentin, and Pelican Bay, showing synchronized hunger strikes, coded letters, and intercepted communications. But the last line made his blood run cold. Coordinated through SHU leadership, current phase, integration achieved. Integration. That word didn't belong in a prison report. It belonged in an experiment. The further Jensen dug, the more the official story began to crumble. The SHU had never been just about isolation. It had been about control, and in trying to eliminate influence, the system had accidentally created something it could no longer contain, an invisible structure that transcended cells, yards, and even walls. These men, stripped of light, human contact, and time, had turned deprivation into design. The hunger strikes that rocked California's prisons that year weren't spontaneous. They were the Syndicate's final test, proof that silence could coordinate rebellion. And Jensen was starting to understand that the prison wasn't the one running the experiment anymore. Late one night, the warden's office door opened. Jensen looked up to see Warden McKee, pale and trembling, clutching a thin folder. "They're shutting it down," McKee said quietly. "The state's caving to the lawsuits. They're transferring dozens out of the SHU. Breaking up the corridor." Jensen should have felt relief. But the look in McKee's eyes wasn't victory, it was fear. "They're not breaking it up," the warden whispered. "They're spreading it." Inside the folder were new transfer orders, inmates from the short corridor reassigned to prisons across the state. Luis Spider Martinez to Lancaster. Henry Vega to Mule Creek. Renteria, presumed dead, marked for federal reclassification. But every transfer order carried the same stamped code at the bottom, S.S-02. The Silence Syndicate wasn't being dismantled. It was being replicated. That same week, a team from Sacramento arrived to oversee the process. Their badges didn't match any known department. They came with sealed equipment crates and a quiet authority that even the warden didn't challenge. The corridor was emptied cell by cell, under heavy surveillance. Cameras rolled non-stop. But once the inmates were gone, the real mystery began. At 3 a.m., as technicians removed the final panel from the SHU's ventilation system, one of them screamed. Inside the vent, Taped against the metal with layers of electrical wire, they found a hidden grid of pencil-marked sheets, maps, lists, dates. A communication network built entirely by hand, cross-referencing hundreds of cells across multiple prisons. And at the bottom of every page, the initials MJ. It took Jensen a moment to realize those were his initials. The handwriting matched his own. Somehow, somewhere, someone had copied his notes from the nights he thought he was documenting everything in secret. Pages he'd hidden at home, in a locked drawer. Pages no one should have had access to. How they got there, he'd never know. But the message was clear. The Syndicate had been watching him, too. 3 months later, Jensen left Pelican Bay for good. He moved south, changed numbers, stopped answering questions from reporters. But silence doesn't forget. One morning, a padded envelope arrived at his door with no return address. Inside, a single photograph, a concrete hallway with identical design to the short corridor. But this one wasn't Pelican Bay. It was unmistakably new. The wall paint was fresh, the number plates clean, the lighting colder. On the back of the photo, a handwritten line, "Welcome to the long corridor." No signature. No explanation. That same day, news broke that California was closing down parts of its solitary housing program, ending decades of inhumane isolation. The public saw it as progress. But deep inside the system, something else was happening. A federal partnership, unnamed and unlisted, was funding behavioral observation units, high-tech facilities designed to monitor inmate conduct under extreme conditions, all under the guise of reform. Jensen watched the news in silence. The anchors praised transparency. The politicians called it a new era of rehabilitation. But in the footage, he saw the same steel doors, the same echoing halls, the same narrow windows where the light barely touched the floor. The corridor hadn't been dismantled. It had evolved. Years later, a journalist named Evelyn Ross tracked Jensen down for an interview. She'd been investigating federal prison reforms and stumbled upon old records, redacted memos, anonymous testimonies, and a leaked document titled Project Silence. She asked Jensen one question: did the Syndicate really exist? He hesitated, then said softly, "You don't understand. It was never just inmates. The walls learned how to listen." When the interview aired, half of it was censored. The official agencies denied the existence of any such project. Pelican Bay's administration claimed the short corridor had been repurposed years earlier. But then, at the end of the broadcast, Evelyn Ross shared a sound clip her team couldn't explain. It came from an old prison mic recording. Barely audible. Static, then tapping. 3 slow beats, pause, then 3 more. The same rhythm Jensen had heard years before. Today, Pelican Bay's SHU stands mostly empty. The state calls it a relic of a darker era. Tour groups walk past its gray doors in silence. But sometimes, when the wind hits the steel vents just right, the sound inside those walls feels deliberate, like something tapping, waiting, remembering. Because maybe the real punishment wasn't isolation at all. Maybe it was what the silence learned to become.